welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. This is going to be a community webinar, so informal. We're going to be answering a lot of questions that you've shared. And the topic is living with Noonan syndrome, insights and perspectives from adults with Noonan syndrome. And we have two lovely adults here, April and Matthew, and we'll introduce you a little bit more later. And just forgot to introduce myself. I'm Naomi. I'm a clinical research assistant at Bridge Lab at Stanford University, and I'll be introducing and moderating the conversation today. So before we really begin, just a quick welcome and housekeeping notes. This event is going to be recorded, and we will share the recording with all the attendees at the end of the event. We have about 1 hour, and most of our time is going to be for questions and open discussion. So we're going to be answering questions that you've submitted now, and then we're going to stop the recording and open it up to a live Q&A. And again, this is a community event. We want to hear from you, so please feel free to utilize the chat to ask questions, connect with one another. We have people from lots of different locations, but this is an opportunity to connect, hopefully. And with that said, a simple agenda. I'm going to finish this off with a little bit more introductions. Oh, and if you are not on mute, please mute yourself for this part of the webinar. So introductions, Q&A, and an open discussion. Okay, so now a warm welcome to our speakers. And I'm actually going to have our speakers do a quick introduction of themselves, if that's okay. So Dr. Green, maybe we'll start with you.
Hi, so I'm super excited. We were just talking that we're so excited for this event and for April and Matthew to join us. Just want to, before I introduce myself, I just want to promise that we'll have a section that everyone can be on camera and talk. We just want to keep the first section in a Q&A version so we can record it and share it with other interested young adults, families, and parents. So I'm Dr. Tamar Green. I'm from Stanford. I have a research lab that focused on Noonan syndrome, NF1, and in general rhizopathies. I'm also a child psychiatrist by training, so most of the interest of my work is around the emotional, cognitive aspects of these syndromes. And I'm, again, super excited to be here today.
April, we will have it over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm glad that you all are here. I am a 55-year-old woman living with Noonans. I live in a small town outside of Austin, Texas called Wimberley. I live with a parent and have just been on that journey for the last year and a half. My journey with Noonans has been varied, from minimal problems and issues to adulthood, having a lot of different challenges. So it's been a really interesting ride, and I'm happy to be able to pass on all of my experiences onto other people.
Thank you, April. And we'll dig into some questions soon. And Matt, over to you.
Hi, I'm Matt Baltes, and I'm from Troy, Ohio, so about an hour, 15 minutes north of Cincinnati. I'm 40 years old, and I have Noonan syndrome, and I also have a son who is 6 years old and in kindergarten, and he also has Noonan syndrome. And I'm just looking forward to sharing my journey and the journey of me and my son, and we just thank you for coming along, and hopefully you can learn some things, and hopefully I can share some things to help ease some things.
Thank you so much, Matt. Okay, and with that, I'm just going to share just a tiny bit about Bridge Lab. Dr. Green already shared, Tamar already shared about the lab, and we do work with families and participants with rhizopathies. I will just add to that some of the work that we do at the lab is share information, so make the findings that we have more accessible to the community, to people with rhizopathies, and then also host webinars like this one. So we have quite a few recorded webinars already about mental health and social skills and advocating for your child's needs in the education system about riskopathies on our website. And we also have a lot of published findings. And I'll share the link to the website. And I will also just say that, well, first of all, I think a lot of people who are here, or at least some people who are here, have participated in our study. So first of all, thank you for that, and thank you for joining us today. We are still currently recruiting participants. We're recruiting participants with Noonan syndrome, all mutations, from 6-year-old until 17. I will share a link with more details and also an opportunity to sign up and see if you're eligible for the study. We would love to see you here at the lab. We would love to have you participate. If you are not eligible, but know someone who is, or know someone else who's interested, it would be really lovely to have you here. And with that, I will kick off our Q&A. So, and all of these questions are questions that you've submitted before, and shared with us before. So we will start with this one. And maybe we'll start with you, April, and move on to you, Matt. What has been your most challenging obstacle of living with Noonan syndrome?
I really thought about this, and I think as a youth, it was just in general, initially keeping up physically. I was a little bit slower. I couldn't run as fast. My heart was really challenged with that. But I learned through the help of the right teachers, the right people in my life, and kind of finding my friend group, that it helped kind of handle all of that. And then it really didn't become a big challenge. Later on, life faces, you face all kinds of new challenges. And so I guess it's always been a little physical, more than anything, over the years. So I don't know if you want any more than that, but that's.
No, that answers it. Sounds like
Okay.
it does change over the lifespan, and that's why we're here to hear from you and Matt. Matt, do you want to share your answer?
Yeah, for me, my most challenging thing was just eating disorders, just, feeding in general. As an infant, I was throwing up all the time. Doctors were trying to figure out what was going on. They weren't exactly sure. But at 18 months, I did get a G-tube, and it took me until I was 18 years old to get off that G-tube. And so it was a long journey, but we just kept at it. And, I went to feeding therapy and learned to eat different foods and kind of came over that fear, and still don't quite understand, what the reason was, and just always kind of felt different about that. And I think that was a challenging thing too, is always kind of feeling different than someone else, is you've got this going on, you don't know exactly why. And it seems like it should be easy to just eat food, but for whatever reason, it wasn't. And so that was probably my most challenging thing. So to overcome that has just been, really great. And so to not have that anymore.
And can you actually, as a father of a child with Noonan syndrome, maybe you can share a little bit about your son's challenging obstacle, or currently just in his age?
Yeah, so my son Jonathan, we weren't sure. My wife had a lot of fluid with him, and we knew he had something going on, but we weren't exactly, sure. We thought maybe a fistula problem, we had trouble breathing or something was going to happen, but ended up it was Noonan syndrome, which is what I kind of thought I was hoping that it would be, because some of the things the doctor said could be much worse. But he does have a lot of hard time with feeding. We're doing feeding therapy, but right now it's mainly just like licking like a sucker, or fun dip. He loves fun dip, just things that aren't necessarily nutritious yet, but we're working on that. And I think a big thing for him is just the fear of like, okay, now what do I do with this food in my mouth? And so it's just trying to figure out a little bit at a time, and try to encourage him. And I think it's helped that, I can show him my scars from the two that I had. And so he can kind of see that, dad's like you, you're like him. And, to give him that hope. And I think that's the hope that I have, is that, he can't do it right now. It took me a long time, but, I have faith that he'll get there eventually.
Thank you for sharing. Oh, I'm sorry. So this was already optimistic, but I need another optimistic question. What has been your most amazing victory while living with Noonan syndrome? And I know that totally changes also probably during the lifespan. So maybe not the most amazing, but something that comes to mind.
I've had a few, but again, I'll go with something that happened to me when I was younger. I went to an all-girls camp for every summer from the time I was about 8 years old to the time I was 17. And it was a horse camp, or that was one of the most important aspects of it. And I was that girl. I was the horse girl. I was obsessed, everything I could learn. And so going to this camp was incredibly exciting. And I realized that horseback riding was sort of the great leveler. I couldn't always keep up with everybody. I wasn't a runner. Sometimes I didn't, like, it took me longer to get to the barn than it did other kids. But eventually I became a very good rider because I could really connect with the horse. And I always kind of connected with the smallest horse, or the one that was a little off, the one that maybe not everybody wanted to ride, but that was the horse for me, right? And I always went, I had a class, we had classes, and as you grew as a rider, you went up in your class rank. Obviously, I became an advanced rider, and I was competing in a Western pleasure program against one of my dearest friends who owned her own horse, brought her own horse to camp, and trained horses at home. Like she was what I was aiming for, right? And one of the last summers we were together, we competed against each other, and I beat her for the first time. And that was one of those things that really taught me a lot about myself. I knew when my horse and I were done that we had done the best that we could do. I knew that we were perfect that moment. Not that we were perfect individually, but that we were perfect together at that moment. And that taught me that that can happen. Like, just because the odds are stacked against you, just because everything may be going, wait a minute, that's not going to work for you. It can. And that helped me pivot a little bit and have a little bit different perspective in kind of the rest of my life in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I would count that one as a big victory.
That's lovely. And also maybe a reminder to, think of strengths I know there are a lot of parents here in your children and activities that they can do to empower them, like horseback riding.
When your kid finds that thing, and it doesn't matter what it is, it's amazing when you get that right combination. Like, all kinds of things are possible then.
That's right. Thank you, April. Matt, what has been your most amazing victory?
I think a little bit with what I shared with the feeding of, getting over that hump of being able to eat without any help through a feeding tube, and just knowing, hey, I can do this by myself. And just even some of the simple things like, I feel great about being able to drive, being a father, going to college. I even went away for college for like a year on my own, and just kind of like taking all those steps that, a lot of people take, but it took me maybe a little bit longer to get there. But kind of like April said, I think, the stamina for me sometimes isn't always there, but it's like, I just keep pushing, and eventually I'll get there because I can be kind of stubborn. So
thank you for sharing. And then also, okay, actually, let's move on to the next question. I'll do follow-ups later because I'm seeing some good questions in the chat. What precautions do you take now that you are an adult, as an adult with Noonan syndrome? And April, I know we've been starting with you all the time. So Matt, maybe we can start with you this time to mix it up.
sure. One thing that really helped is my son goes to Cincinnati Children's, and one thing was brought up is they have an adult unit there. And so I started seeing a cardiologist there. And so that's been really helpful. Because they did find that through an MRI that my pulmonary artery is kind of dilated. And so they're kind of keeping close eyes on it. So it does show that it's really important, even though I don't have like a lot of heart issues, that we keep an eye on things, and they're doing a good job there. And it's people that are familiar with Noonan syndrome, where my adult cardiologist I had before wasn't really familiar with Noonan's, as a lot of people I find, with doctors, they're just not familiar with it. And so I just have to be a little careful, not push myself too far, with like running or exercising and things. I just gotta take it easy and go a little bit slower, kind of like I've always had to do. So not like a big change there. And one thing I think that's been really big is my wife really helped me of taking a look at like mental health and just looking at like all the anxiety that I think that I had just, growing up. And so I've worked with my doctor on that, and not being afraid to share that, I can be pretty anxious on things, and, can get stressed out pretty easily on some things. So I think it's working with that, and just overall with Noonan syndrome, it can affect most of your body parts. And so you just have to take it day by day, and you don't know what tomorrow may bring, and whatever it is, you're just gonna take it on and deal with the challenge as it comes. And that's how I kind of handle it, I guess.
Thank you for sharing. April, what precautions do you take?
Well, since my 30s, my heart issues have really changed and morphed and gotten a little more challenging. So I have a great cardiology team. I see my doctors regularly. And then I was recently diagnosed with osteoporosis. So it is going to the gym, it's talking with a PT, it is doing things like I jump on my little mini tramp to keep my bones strong. And as Matt said, it's also mental health. Like, I'm a caregiver for my father. So I go to a therapist, I seek out support groups to help with that, but also to kind of help my own stuff, my own challenges that I think sometimes come up as an adult that I didn't necessarily deal with as a kid, because in the 70s and 80s, we didn't do that. We didn't really talk about those things. We didn't talk about the stuff that we had been through. And so sometimes it'll come up, and so it's dealing with those things and taking care of myself in that way. I'm going to a women's retreat this weekend to take care of my whole self. So I think it's not unlike what everybody else does that doesn't have a rare disease. We just may have to be a little more cautious. I mean, I take blood thinners, so I have to really plan for those kinds of things and plan when I eat. But otherwise, it's just being good to myself in whatever way I can.
Thank you. And both of you mentioned mental health, and Dr. Green, as a psychiatrist, I wonder if maybe you can talk a little bit about that or share. I know you work with children.
Yeah, so I think I was very excited that April and Matthew come, because I have kind of like a theory, but I think there's nothing out there. So and now you guys kind of like confirmed my theory. That's that our lab been focusing mostly on the younger ages and focusing on neurodevelopmental issues, so social interactions, attention, executive functions. And I know from our previous discussions that these things were a thing when you were younger, but I had a very strong guess about anxiety and depression, and I think it's just, mental health can be very transparent. And if no one talks about it, no one knows about it, right? It's not something you see on a person. So first of all, huge thank you for sharing. I know it's not easy to share your own, issues, but also to encourage other people to tell us about it, because that gives me you know, it gives me an idea, and then I go to NIH, the National Institute of Health, for submitting grants, not always getting them, but if I get them, I get to study that, and you guys can get, you know, information. And the same way that we understand that there's cardiology doesn't end when a child is 18, so mental health also doesn't, you know, resolve itself. So it's probably an ongoing thing. So yeah, that would be my, I'm just learning a lot. That's what I want to say from you guys.
Okay, and we'll move on to the next question because I see we do have so many great questions in the chat that I want to make sure that we'll get to. So the next question is one that I really love in particular. Someone asked, how would you have wanted Noonan syndrome described to you as a child for easier understanding? And Matt, you have a child.
Right.
So
Yeah, so I can take this from both ways. So I really like this question. It was really good, really gave me a lot to kind of think about. And I didn't find out for sure that, well, I didn't really find out officially that I had Noonan's until my son was born. It was brought up when I was a teenager, probably about 6th grade. I stopped growing basically. I was growing not very much at all. And it's like, this is when you're supposed to hit your growth spurt. I'm already short. What's going on here? And so the doctor then kind of had this theory and idea that I probably had Noonan syndrome. But the biggest thing that kind of came out from it wasn't so much like, how is Noonan syndrome going to help you, that you know this now, and like what things do you need to watch out for. It was more like, well, you need to know that you have Noonan syndrome so you know if you want to have children or not. And I thought, well, I want to have children. I don't care. This hasn't stopped me. And so that kind of was like a turnoff. So I never really went through with the genetic testing and wasn't sure back then how insurance would pay for it. And so looking at my son, I just focused so many on the good things and great things he can do. Like he can't ride a tricycle yet at age 6. He can't. He has a hard time like cutting, but he's really good at drawing. He is really smart when it comes to reading. Can probably read it at least at a 3rd grade level. And he likes science. I'm a science teacher, so he's always asking me, what did you learn in science today? What are you teaching the kids? And so it's more just focusing on the great things that he has and the great qualities. And it's like, we're going to work on the things that need to be worked on. I think as for myself, I felt like so many times it was all these things that I couldn't do. And it's like, we got to try to fix this. We got to try to help you so that, you know, you're taller. We got to try to help you to get off the feeding tube. We've got to try to help you, you know, to draw better and to cut better and to do all these things that kind of seem hard. And so I think if I'm a kid, I just want it to be like, okay, be upfront about some things that, you know, you're going to have to see some doctors and stuff. And we need to do this to keep you healthy. And that's kind of what we try to do with Jonathan, is to say, hey, buddy, we're going to see a doctor today. You know, doctors are here to help us. They're here to, you know, help us to do the things we can't always do, and to check things out to make sure everything's working the right way. And with his brain of loving science, that kind of helps and makes him understand, like, yeah, okay, I got to go to the doctor today. And he kind of understands that. So I just think it's, you know, just be patient and take it slow, and don't come like full board on it. Just kind of take your time when you're talking to your kid, and just talk to them about how much you love them, how much you care about them, what a great person that they are still. And a lot of the Noonan kids I've met, and adults too, it's like they have a lot of joy still, even though they might have a lot of issues, and they can be very resilient as well.
that's really lovely and beautiful to hear, Matt. And sounds like you are focusing on the good things and also kind of focusing on bettering the symptoms that are being that are more challenging or an issue, versus looking at maybe Noonan as a whole for a child that's kind of difficult. April, I know I would love to hear from you, and also I know that you had a special relationship with your parents who talked to you very openly about Noonan syndrome. So maybe you can share about that as well.
I learned with my parents, because Noonan's was so young in the sense that most people had never heard of it. It was something that was sort of guessed at because they realized I didn't have Turner's. And I was probably 8 or 9 when they started talking about Noonan syndrome. And then I became part of this unofficial study at a teaching hospital in Galveston, Texas. And I'd go every 6 months. I'd get measured and tested, and I'd have some, looking back on it, I probably had some cognitive exams and all kinds of things. And I knew, without ever having really discussed this with anybody, that I was in a unique position to teach these people about people like me, even if I didn't know how many people there were like me. And so I knew that whatever they were learning from me, I would keep doing this for as long as I could, because I knew it was going to help somebody else down the line. It's like we all kind of cognitively knew that, without, none of us remember ever having that discussion with the doctors, but we all knew it. And so it was a very different kind of thing. And so I don't know if I would have changed anything, because it was kind of fascinating along the way. But it would have been nice to have doctors that had a little more knowledge, so that they could answer my questions instead of me answering their questions. So, but my parents were great at helping me find my voice. So they listened to me when something didn't feel right and I wasn't happy with something. We would have a discussion and we would figure out another solution. And I've had some issues with textures with food. I had to have a palate expander and do all that kind of thing. And so I will say that my parents were incredibly patient with all of that, even though they had no clue that it was associated with a syndrome. They just knew it was associated with me. So I think that that's also something that every kid's going to be different. Every child is going to have a different challenge or challenges. And I think if you realize that, okay, this is just my kid, this is just me dealing with this, how can I make it easier? And how can we try to understand? And even if we don't understand, how can we work through this? And for me, that's what my parents did. And it made it a lot easier and less judgmental. So.
Thank you. And our next question is a little bit similar and kind of along the same lines. We were asked, although I want my son to know about his diagnosis and that he will be given all the specialists and all the information, don't want it to define him or for others to treat him differently. How do you recommend approaching sharing the diagnosis? And we touched on this, and I think this time I'll actually start with you, Tamar. As a clinician, how would you recommend sharing the diagnosis to children?
I've been asked about it a lot. First, I want to say there's no one answer I can say that will fit every child. It's really, really depend on the child and their kind of like tendencies, their interest. What I find very, like, I would say 3 kind of like guidelines. One is that kids know much more than you think. So a child knows that he's shorter than his friends, and a child knows that it's harder for them to run. And they know that they can't ride bicycles the same way as their friends. And they know that they struggle at school. So I think, don't think that they don't know. That's my first kind of like, so coming from that, it becomes much more like an easier decision, because they know that something is going on. And our brain don't like uncertainties. So kind of in a way, if you can at least tell something about what's going on, it's usually reducing anxiety, rather than, I think many parents are afraid to share because it's kind of like anxiety provoking and putting a label. So it's actually sometimes reduces anxiety. The second thing, what I kind of think about is like follow the child. You might have a child that is super, Matthew said like that his son is like super interested in science. So I guess he's asking questions. So I would kind of like, go with the child, right? Like with their question, not avoiding them, trying to answer them. And at some point it needs to name it. I would just name it at following their questions. And the last thing is that we always need to share the information at the level of the child development. So you won't go, and I think about it as a spiral conversation, right? You can have a conversation when the child is like 4-year-old, but you're gonna have a different conversation when the child is like 11, and you gonna have completely different conversation when she's 16, and a different conversation when they're 20s, and thinking about family and other kind of every age something else kind of like so I would say that this is the 3 principles, but the principle that underlies all of that, having like a gene that defines that you have a Noonan syndrome, is just having one variable in your life that is it, but it doesn't mean that you have like, it's not, you're not defined by that at all, and the possibilities are out there for you. And just might, I'm repeating I'm repeating both of our guests, but it just might take more time. So kind of like, and I think as parents, this is our job to remind that all the time, that it might take longer, but things can happen. So I hope it's, yeah.
Thank you.
I talked a lot.
No, that's a great
Stop
answer.
now.
April and Matt, do you have anything to add about the approach about sharing the diagnosis, something that worked for you, something that comes to mind? I know you just talked about that a little bit.
Well, I have more of a story. So again, with the summer camp, I reunited with one of my dearest friends there about 15 years ago. And she shared a story with me that I never had known this, that the first year that I arrived, my friend's mother was an RN and a head of the surgical wing or in the nursing area of a prominent Houston hospital in the 70s. And one of the owners of this summer camp was an RN. And that RN, when she got my application for the camp, she calls my friend's mother and asks, okay, I have this child who's coming in. She has Noonan syndrome. Have you ever heard of it? I've never heard of it. What do we do? Like, are there precautions we need to take? Is there anything we need to do for her? And my friend's mom said, I've never heard of it. I don't know. But let's think about it and talk about it. And the owner asked if she would talk to her daughter and see if her daughter would kind of keep an eye out and make sure nobody picked on me or I didn't have any problems. And after the first week of being in camp, or first couple of days even, my friend goes to the owner of the camp and says, don't worry about her. She's already made friends. Like, it's okay. So I think kids will find ways to get through that minutia of a syndrome.
Mhm.
They may be the shortest one. They may be slower than most of their friends, but their personality, their humor, their quirkiness, their uniqueness, that thing that they love, the fact that pretty much everybody that I've met with Noonan syndrome loves to talk. Those kinds of things sort of automatically help them overcome any concerns about that diagnosis. At least that's my perspective, and also what I've noticed with some of the people that I know that have Noonan. So
Thank you for sharing.
that helps.
I'm hearing a lot about noticing the strengths and highlighting those from all of you. Okay, question specifically to Matt. Did you have any issues while at school as you were diagnosed later in life? Did you have any idea that you might have a health condition like Noonan's? And you touched a little bit on it, but maybe you can tell us the story of the diagnosis a little bit more.
Yeah, so, we didn't know what was going on. I mean, I was in the hospital, throwing up. Doctors kind of kept me away from my mom for a period of time to make sure that my mom wasn't like forcing me to throw up, because back in the 80s, there were some things going on. And so they found out, obviously, my mom was a great mom, and so was my dad. And and that wasn't the case, but they were concerned. They thought maybe I'd have to live in a bubble because I was sick all the time and throwing up, but that didn't happen. But I did have cysts on the back of my brain that I had to keep an eye on as well, because they were kind of growing a little bit faster than I was growing at times. But then that kind of like eventually slowed down. So my parents obviously knew, and I knew that I was different than everybody else. My stamina wasn't like everybody else, couldn't run as fast, couldn't do things as quickly as everyone else. I had a sister who was 3 years younger than me and could do things, before I was doing things at times, and growing faster than I was. And so those things were hard, and we definitely knew something was going on, but didn't have a label to it. And I think with Noonan's, kind of like we approach it now, is we know what things can come up, and that's really great, but not everybody is going to have those problems, and not everyone has the same problem. So we just kind of wait for things to come. And I guess as it comes, you're kind of prepared, you're, on the lookout, your doctors are keeping a good eye on things, and you just kind of go with the flow, I guess. So, when things are good, things are going good. And when, a bump in the road comes, then you deal with that bump. Like this past summer, I was diagnosed with having skin cancer. So I got a big scar on my forehead, but, it's just things that happen. And it's not a Noonan thing, but it also shows that a lot of people, even if you don't have Noonan's, have difficulties, whether it's family life or physical challenges, but it can also be really hard just for family issues. And as a fifth grade teacher, I see that with a lot of kids of, we're all dealing with things, and those things that we're dealing with, shouldn't define us and don't change things. And, we're just here to try to help take care of each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, another great question. And I think this is our last question before we move on to the Q&A session, the open Q&A session. So April, maybe we can start with you. What would you say to your teenage self? How would you encourage teenagers to have self-confidence and reassure them that they can achieve great things?
As cliche as it sounds, be yourself. I
Mhm.
think we all, at least when we're younger and even into adulthood, we try to fit in where we think it'll make things a little easier. And honestly, I would have told myself, dye your hair pink, since that's what you want to do. I would have said, hang out with whoever you are connected to, because maybe it's not only the band kids, maybe it's the these other interesting people. And I would have said, maybe take a few more classes that encouraged a passion that you were interested in trying, even if you fail, because you learn something about yourself through failure just as you do success. In fact, I think sometimes you learn more. So I would have just said, I would have told myself to push myself a little bit harder, try those things that I wanted to try, but was either too afraid or didn't feel like the people around me would understand.
How do you keep yourself organized?
And just to say, this is also a very small time frame, and you have so much more time to excel and to grow and to find yourself and become maybe a different person than you were when you're a teenager than when you're 30. We grow so vastly. So play, have fun, just relax a little bit more.
Be yourself, have fun.
And just don't, I don't know, don't take yourself so seriously sometimes. That's
Mhm.
what I would have told myself. I was a little too I always wanted to be perfect. And I would have just told myself, don't worry about that.
Matt, what would you say to your teenage self?
Yeah.
I like what April said, it's trying to relax and trying to realize that, try these things at this age that you're interested in. I played baseball, played soccer, played basketball. Wasn't great at it, but I loved it. And I loved the team aspect. And when I was in high school, I played golf and found that I was pretty good at golf. And so it's just kind of like finding where your strengths are and, maybe you're good at academics, and so you can be I was part of the academic team. Wasn't the best at any of these things by any means, but I look back and I'm glad I tried it. Like basketball was probably the hardest thing I did. I thought, how much are we going to have to run? I'm not a good runner. Is it ever going to stop? But other kids would quit, but I didn't quit. I kept going, and I think other kids see that, and they see that, well, you are being resilient. You don't let things stop you, and I think it can be an inspiration for others.
Lots of really good advice. And as you were about speaking, I was thinking this is good advice for your teenage self with Noonan syndrome and anyone's teenage self. This is just really good advice. Okay, so before we open it up to the wonderful questions we have in the chat, I do just want to quickly go over some resources we like to share at the end of these things, these webinars. I'm going to send an email, and if we're watching this on demand, you'll have a link, all the links on YouTube, but just to these organizations that can help, especially parents, but also just generally, if you have Noonan, if you have osteopathy, you can leverage that. So Parents Helping Parents, Exceptional Parents Unlimited, there's the Disability Rights and Educational Defense Fund, and then a few more resources here, Family Voices, National Disability Rights Network, and Relationship